Your new biography of Lester Pearson is part of a wonderful series by Penguin about great Canadians. Those of us who aren't students of history might not fully appreciate just the extent of his accomplishments in that very short period of 5 years where he was Prime Minister.
It is considered by some to be the most productive legislative period in Canadian history.
In a minority parliament.
In a minority parliament. In that period, 63 to 1968, we get the Canada Pension Plan. We get we get universal health care. We get the flag, which is in many ways his finest hour because of the courage it took. We get open immigration. We get the Auto Pact. We get amendments to the criminal code.
Bilingualism.
Bilingualism and biculturalism.
For all his accomplishments, notoriety, he didn't seem very prime ministerial. I mean, there are people who said that he was kind of boring and bland. I mean, you've made the point he was not a particularly exciting campaigner, and that even at the time, his government seemed to be meandering and kind of scandal prone. I mean, what's your take on his leadership qualities?
Well, first of all, he arrives in the age of television, and he's not exactly camera ready. He has a lisp. He had the head bobs. He's not ready for that. And he says later in life, he says, I would like to be judged on my record, not a recording, because the recording doesn't help him. His leadership, and this is at the nub of why he's often misinterpreted, and in a contemporary, at the time, people like Peter Newman, who writes the classic contemporary account, the distemper of our times, about his government, says he really wasn't that good. He wasn't that great. Because the government seems to be lurching, it seems to be fitful, it seems to be a government without a direction. 6 ministers resign, all from Quebec in scandal, some with cause, some not. And he looks like the captain of a ship which is going aground. And the reason that it looks this way is because he has this rather genteel style, he doesn't focus, he's not a great campaigner, and he's not packaging what he's selling. And he's not calling this anything. Lyndon Johnson is legislating the United States. He's calling it the Great Society. Pierre Trudeau will follow Lester Pearson and call it the Just Society. He's legislating.
No nomenclature. No
nomenclature. And he's not wrapping it up in a package and it's got a red ribbon and presenting it to Canadians. So people like Peter Newman and others who were writing, Richard Gwynn, writing at the time, said, we get the sense that nothing is really happening here. Then we look at the volume and record, and it's extraordinary. Pearson's Canada is today's Canada. All those things, or many of those things, in which we see ourselves, are part of our iconography, our pension plan, health care, bilingualism, peacekeeping, which actually comes earlier but is associated inextricably with Lester Pearson. All those things are there. And yet, at the time, it looks rather like smoke and mirrors. It looks like a lot of fire and brimstone, and a lot has to do with John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson facing each other across the aisle in this low, guttural catfight every day. The fiercest of partisans, John Diefenbaker, and the most genteel of people, Mike Pearson. They don't like each other, and it contributes to a sense among Canadians that nothing is getting done in Ottawa except they're fighting.
Let's go back. Pearson grows up, part of a long line of Methodist preachers, very idealistic, goes to University of Toronto, studying under Vincent Massey, and he enrolls in war, World War I. He comes back to Canada, tries semi-pro ball, some menial jobs, decides he really has to go back to school, gets a scholarship to Oxford. There he meets an absolute remarkable cadre of colleagues who end up being the greatest diplomats, George Ignatieff, Charles Ritchie, some of the greatest academics, S. Scott Reed, Eugene Forsey, greatest politicians, David Lewis. How does this affect him?
Well, he's acquiring a sense of Canadian nationalism there. He's not treated as a coolie there. He's not treated as a colonial. He's very self-confident. He has this strong sense that I'm going to be here for 2 years. I'm going to play hockey here for the Swiss national team. By the way, he played every sport. And whenever I
he's a fantastic
athlete. And whenever I talk to people who remember him, they say, you must remember Mike Pearson as a sportsman. He comes back to the University of Toronto where he gets what he wants, which is a teaching position in, once again, this emerging department of history, which will have Douglas Creighton and others in it. But Oxford shapes him that way, and that he has an emerging Canadian nationalism, but I'm not going to stay in England. I love England, but I'm not going to live there.
Between the wars, he joins the fledgling Foreign Service at this time, and we know that he rises to the absolute pinnacle of this. What distinguishes him as a diplomat? What is it about Mike Pearson that allows him to rise through the ranks and establish his kind of dominance within the field?
He's empathetic. He's enormously charming. He believes in compromise. Many of those attributes of the diplomat do not serve him well in politics at all. Compromise, saving face. Victory is giving your opponent a sense that he's won too. In diplomacy, it's not in politics. Pearsonian diplomacy becomes him. He begins to characterize or personify a Canada which by the late 30s and the 40s, when we're more than carrying our weight in the war, is going on the world and doing interesting things. And he becomes the face of the golden age of Canadian diplomacy through high intelligence, preparation, obsessive preparation. We are arriving at international conferences with virtual treaties written, and the world is responding to us. NATO is a perfect example. I mean, NATO is largely, in 1948, his idea.
I want to stop and ask you to expand there, because you've written another book on kind of the history of foreign policy. I mean, you said in passing this was the golden age of foreign diplomacy in Canada, and then we kind of forget what role Canada played in the world at that particular time and how Canada was viewed in the world at that particular time. Expand on that for me.
It's hard to believe today that we could emerge from the Second World War with the fourth largest military in the world. Of course, there were good reasons. Germany and Japan, Italy were on their backs. The armies of the other great powers we were fourth. We had been in that period showing up on boards, munitions boards and others, and was saying to people, you know, we're escorting half the shipping across the Atlantic. We're taking a regular bombing run over Germany. We're landing, or we would land, on Juno Beach at Normandy. We are really carrying our weight. We're training tens of thousands of pilots in the Commonwealth training program. We would like to have some representation. We're pushing out, and after the war, when we're demobilizing, and we're getting ready for a peacetime economy, the Department of Foreign Affairs is not closing embassies, it's opening them. And he and his cadre of erudite, intelligent, aware men, because they were all men in those days, largely white Anglo-Saxon, reflecting Canada, almost no francophones.
And they were the best and the brightest.
They were the best. They were products of Oxbridge and Cambridge and the Sorbonne. They're going out and doing these interesting things. And Canada is, to use a phrase that has been perhaps overworked, punching above its weight. We're showing up and we're doing important things. And he becomes the face of that. When NATO needs three wise men to rethink itself in 1955, it turns to Mike Pearson. When they need a four-man group to imagine Israel as it was, or Palestine, he does it. When American power needs to be moderated during the Korean War, he intervenes and he makes enemies of the Americans. Dean Acheson can't believe those moralizing Canadians thinking they're going to tell the United States what to do. We have a sense of, because we are carrying our weight, because we have this, what became known, John F. Kennedy in 1959 called our diplomatic service perhaps the finest in the world. He's the face of that. Now, from 48, we should note, from 48 to 57, he's foreign minister.
He's now the minister. He's
now foreign minister.
Public
so
life.
He has this long, long run. And today we live in a time, and since Mike Pearson, the average time a foreign minister has spent in office in Canada is about 1 year, 9 months, something like that. He spent 7, 8, 9 years.
9 years.
So it was that training, it was that familiarity, it was that absolute, he had insinuated himself so carefully and so seamlessly into the international system that when it came to play his big role on the stage in '56, he was ready.
Let's talk about that, because the pinnacle of his diplomatic career is clearly the Nobel Prize, which he wins for his involvement in the Suez Crisis. Take us back and tell that story.
Well, it's 1956, and he has been foreign minister for 8 years, and things are deteriorating in the Middle East. And in the fall of 1956, the British and French hatch a plan with the Israelis to retake the Suez Canal, which Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, has nationalized.
He's nationalized it.
Anthony Eden, with whom Mike Pearson played tennis in Geneva in the 1930s, has hatched a plan secretly with the French to retake the canal. He doesn't consult anybody. And when Louis Saint Laurent and Mike Pearson hear that they have launched this action, they can't believe it. They are absolutely stupefied. They're staggered that Anthony Eden could be doing something that they consider absolutely reckless. The Russians are threatening to intervene. The Americans are angry as hell with the French and the British. So the alliance,
they've got their navies right in the canal.
They've got their navies there, and they think it's going to blow up. Meanwhile, Hungary, the Soviets have walked into Hungary about 3 or 4 or 5 days earlier. So suddenly, Mike Pearson's at the UN, and Suez is playing on the main stage in the General Assembly. In the Security Council, Hungary is playing, and people would tell me, I looked at interviews from the 1970s when people said it was the Watergate. Their frame was Watergate, and how public attention was fixed on the UN in a way we couldn't imagine. Live television coverage came from the UN. Who is on this floodlit podium every night? It's Mike Pearson of Canada.
You say it's almost like it's Moses with the tablets, the expectation that he is going to solve this problem.
Well, when it gets really bad, and we're into November of 1956, and things are deteriorating, and the British are ready to drop paratroopers in, and the Israelis are already there, the Russians are threatening to, I won't say march, but they're rattling the nuclear saber. It's going to split the Commonwealth because India is uncomfortable. It's the developed world against the developing world. A lot of people are sympathetic to Egypt and Nasser's nationalistic aspirations. Mike Pearson walks in. He had taken a plane down from Ottawa, and there's this buzz in the room. What does Mike think? What has Mike got? They're wonderful. You can read all the transcripts of people in their interviews. What has he got? Who is going to solve this? And Mike Pearson goes to the microphone and begins to imagine how we can get out of this. And he has an idea of a peacekeeping force. Now, he doesn't invent peacekeeping, and it's a mythology that is developed around him. But he knows exactly what to introduce at the right time. And how he does it is an extraordinary story. He doesn't write the resolution. The resolution is actually written in Washington. And Henry Cabot Lodge, who had been a senator in the United States Senate, whom John F. Kennedy had beaten a few years earlier, is the American ambassador. And the Americans have a resolution that would introduce this peacekeeping force, but they can't introduce it. And Henry Cabot Lodge says, I walked out from under the podium, and I said, who am I going to hand it to? Of course I'm going to hand it to Mike Pearson of Canada, because he knows everybody. He knows all these foreign ministers by their first name. And so Pearson introduces this resolution, which for the first time will introduce the idea of a peacekeeping force, of putting between, injecting in a sense, a body between two warring sides. This has never been done in a concerted way. We had forms of peacekeeping before. And this diffuses the crisis. And so in November of that year, suddenly this, it's disarmed. Now I should hasten to add that at home, and Mike Pearson is hailed as a great savior. At home, I can tell you, he is ripped apart by John Diefenbaker.
This is because we're standing against Britain.
We're standing against Britain, and to a degree France. Yes. But it's mainly in Diefenbaker's sense. It's all Britain. You've betrayed the mother country. You've run into the arms of the Americans. We are suspicious of the Americans. We're a British country. And many people would argue, although the polling data isn't exactly accurate, that the defeat of the Liberal Party 7 months later, in June of '57, was largely, and some people would argue, attributed to our stand in Suez. 3 months later, the Nobel Committee awards the Nobel Prize to Mike Pearson and said he had saved the world.
And many Canadians, many historians, see this as kind of Canada and Pearson's finest hour, because it defines Canada in a way that we still kind of see ourselves as the middle power, the honest broker. But you have a different kind of take on this. You say that in some ways that legacy, that image of ourselves, which we continue to hold to this day, has held us back as a nation, has held back our influence in the world, because we've got this notion that somehow we're peacekeeping angels. Expand on that.
In some ways, the Nobel Prize was about the worst thing that could happen to Mike Pearson and us, in some ways. I don't mean to be churlish about it, because it's a great, and it was his finest hour on the diplomatic stage. But there was a sense after that, and there has been an enduring sense since, that all we have ever done is peacekeeping, that we never fought, and we did fight in the First World War, the Second World War, in Korea, and now we're in Afghanistan, which is not a peacekeeping mission, though many Canadians believe it is. And that this guy was kind of a mystical Prince of Peace, sitting on Mount Olympus in saffron-colored robes, uttering incantations about peace, and was a pacifist. He never was. This is the man who founded NATO. He believed in hard power. He believed in peacekeeping, absolutely. He believed in the United Nations prominently in a paramount way. But the idea that this is all we've ever done and all we ever would do and would become our international vocation, and statistically isn't so. We had far more committed to NATO than we ever did in peacekeeping. But We do, from that period on, become the world's leading peacekeeper. 10% of the forces come from Canada. We teach it, we embody it, and every time the phone rings from New York and Ottawa, up to 1988, we answered it, and there wasn't a mission we refused. It's only in 1988 that we began to refuse missions, and today, when you look at the number of countries which are doing peacekeeping, and their commitment of forces, we are not even in the game. We're 55, it changes every month. We have something like 78 peacekeepers internationally. We've changed, but this allowed us to believe, and incorrectly so I believe, that's all we ever did, and has become part of our iconography in a way that can become corrosive if that's all you think you ever did internationally. And he pushed back on this, but he wears it.
He becomes the leader of the Liberal Party off this incredible high, and just gets walloped in the 1958 election, one of the worst electoral defeats ever. Yet, unlike what we see in modern politics today, there's no real movement to dump him.
He becomes leader in 1958, and he's misadvised by Jack Pickersgill and others. He walks in the House of Commons. He had almost no opposition for the leadership. Paul Martin, and Walter Gordon cut the check. $3,000 was what they spent on his leadership campaign, imagine. He walks in the House of Commons. He's misadvised. He believes that the Liberals have been out of power for 7 months, that the country's natural governing party. It's time we came back.
It's a minority conservative government.
Minority conservative, 7 seats,
right.
7 seats, and John Diefenbaker's prime minister. He moves a motion in the House of Commons in which the Liberal Party is going to call for the removal of the Conservative government, but not an election.
Right.
They're going to be very smart about it.
Deja vu all over again.
Yeah,
he's going to go to the GG and say,
go to the GG.
Put me in power.
50 years ago exactly.
Yeah.
The Governor General, John Diefenbaker responds to Mike Pearson, rips him apart, goes to the Governor General, asks for an election. Election's on March 31st. It is so bad. The Conservatives are going to win the largest majority up to that time in Canadian history, 208 seats. And as the return, Mike Pearson has no idea how bad it's going to be. And as the returns are coming in, he's sitting with his wife, Marion, who is known for her tartness. And Marion says, as she's surveying this wreckage, Mike, you've lost everything. You've even won your seat. And she says this because now she knows this guy is committed to the Liberal Party, the rebuilding of the Liberal Party, for what looked like it's going to be a decade. Because after all, they were down to 48 seats, and the Conservative Party 208 seats. And how do you dislodge a majority that large? Everybody thought it couldn't be done, and they all thought Mike would resign. He had a great offer from the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. They were going to pay him $100,000. In 1958, $100,000 was an enormous amount of money, multiplied by 7. Marion wants him out of politics. She's never liked the political game, and he's been insulated from that as foreign minister. He's never been in the cut and thrust of the House much because there was, up to Suez, pretty much a bipartisan foreign policy. Thereupon begins what I call the greatest unacknowledged achievement of Mike Pearson's life, one of those lives in which he rebuilds the Liberal Party and in 5 years brings it back to power, albeit with a minority.
2 minorities. In fact, when you've talked about how remarkably productive it is, and with the passage of time, I think history has said this is perhaps the most productive 5 years in the history of our Parliament. Minority government. We're looking now, the last 3-4 years in Canada, hardly productive. What was he doing different as Prime Minister of a minority government that we're not doing today?
Well, 2 things it's fair to say when we make the comparison, and we do make this comparison today, and we should. 2 things. One is Mike Pearson nearly had a majority. They were only 3 seats shy. In 63, they were only 3 or 4 seats shy of a majority. He had a lot of room. He had a very strong minority government. Second is the New Democratic Party under the leadership of Tommy Douglas was very close to the Liberal Party. There were, I didn't know this till I researched this book, there were exploratory talks about merging the 2 parties in 1965. So it was not a great stretch that to have not a coalition, but to have a working arrangement with the New Democrats that would get this legislation through. Also, the Conservatives were self-destructing under the leadership of John Diefenbaker. The Quebec wing of the Conservative Party, which had been very big in 1958 when Dief wins something like 55 seats in Quebec. It's a huge number. They're very sympathetic to Mike Pearson, who's reaching out to Quebec through bilingualism. So there's that. There's also money. The economy is expanding in a huge way. There's a lot of money to pay for programs. That having been said, Mike Pearson's a diplomat. He likes the idea of negotiating. He feels comfortable with the créditistes. There were the Liberals, the Conservatives, the New Democrats, and the Social Credit Party was two wings: the créditistes in Quebec and the Social. And he'll make alliances with anybody because he only needs 3 or 4 seats. So he talks to everybody about everything. He is not a person who wants to crush his opposition. Temperamentally, he and Stephen Harper couldn't be more worlds apart. He is by nature a conciliator.
Of his many accomplishments, he, as an Anglophone, is quite prescient about what is going on in Quebec. He understands the importance of the Quiet Revolution. He reaches out, tries to recruit the 3 wise men once he's in Parliament, and lets Quebec opt out of the Canada Pension Plan in 1964, setting up kind of an orthodoxy of parallelism that occurs to this day, that Quebec doesn't have to participate in national programs. How would Pearson see that legacy today, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because, and many historians have looked at Mike Pearson in Quebec. He sees very early what's going on in Quebec. I mean, he sees the bombs going off in 62 and 63, the emerging Révolution tranquille, and the whole sense that things are really, under Jean Lesage, things are moving in Quebec, and how do you get your mind around it? In 1963 to 1965, his first government, John English, the historian, who, in fairness, writes the definitive 2-volume biography of Lester Pearson's prime ministry, or of life, actually, says this was the greatest period of decentralization in Canadian history. Mike Pearson we had largely a unitary government, which had been shaped in the Second World War.
Yeah, the province very weak, very weak.
And Mike Pearson's virtually opening up the store. Right. He sees himself, if he couldn't be Secretary General of the United Nations, he's happy to be Secretary General of Canada. And he's happy to have a kind of a domestic diplomacy. He meets the premiers, I think it's 116 times, or their interprovincial meetings.
Right.
They go on forever. Unimaginable today.
This is the base of cooperative federalism,
yes,
too.
This is and he believes it's natural. You must give tax points. You must give tax credits. If you can do it, if you can do what you can, the Constitution. And he is open to that kind of a Quebec. In '65, he recruits the 3 wise men you just referred to: Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, Jean Pelletier, and Jean Marchand. And they are tougher on Quebec. And his whole view changes, and from 65 to 68, it's a different view of Quebec. So there are 2 Pearsonian legacies on Quebec. There is the cooperative federalism of his first government, and there's the much tougher, constitutionally driven view of Quebec, 63 to 65. He believed when he left in 68, that his successor should be Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. He couldn't say it, but he supported him. And one of the reasons is he said, I cannot handle Quebec anymore. I'm the last prime minister who will be unable to speak French or English. I mean, but you have to be bilingual. Pierre Trudeau understands this. I was a relief pitcher for the middle innings. Pierre Trudeau will go the long run, and he'll throw harder and faster.
Let's talk about Trudeau, because he's very hard on Pearson when Pearson accepts defense missiles in Canada. How, once he gets in cabinet, does Pearson influence his view of the world and his prime ministership subsequent?
Big time. First of all, they don't appoint him to cabinet right away, but Mike Pearson makes him his parliamentary secretary, which in those days had a lot of cachet.
Absolutely.
He then, within a year, makes him justice minister, and he gives him free hand to legislate. I mean, the amendments to the criminal code, you remember the phrase, the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation? We all remember that. Divorce law, homosexual, or early stuff. It used to be you needed a bill of the Senate to be divorced in Canada. That all went in 68. So he's given free rein, but most of all, he's given the constitutional file. And there is this famous clash, you may remember it, between Daniel Johnson and Pierre Trudeau in February of 1968 over the Constitution. And this is Trudeau emergent.
And establish him as the tough guy.
Establish him as the tough guy. Mike Pearson knows this and says it will take this kind of a person to deal with Quebec. He didn't. Now, later on, so their relationship is pretty good. After Pearson leaves, little things Trudeau's insensitive about. The day Mike Pearson is in the House of Commons after Trudeau has won the leadership, traditionally the House of Commons pays tribute to a departing leader. Pierre Trudeau reconvenes the House the Monday after the Saturday in which he is declared the leader at the convention in Ottawa, and asks for dissolution so quickly that Mike Pearson is a private member for 20 minutes and never gets the parting tributes and accolades of the House. And he writes in his diary that day, tough. he felt that. Later on, when Trudeau begins to reimagine Canadian foreign policy and believes in the national interest and is turning his back on Mike's helpful fixer and honest broker, we have in the archives Mike Pearson's notes in the margins of the white papers of those days and how he drafted a letter to Trudeau. He didn't like it. So Mike Pearson was a diplomat, but he was hurt by Trudeau in the end. Trudeau didn't intend to hurt him, but it was just the way of a tough guy.
With this great, distinguished career, I mean, and you've had the opportunity now to look at it from up close and from a distance. What's Pearson's greatest legacy to Canada going to be?
Well, I maintain that today's Canada is Pearson's Canada. As I said earlier, the iconography of our time, those things in which we see ourselves, for better or for worse, peacekeeping, something of a social welfare state, a social egalitarianism through pensions and healthcare, bilingualism, a liberal society, a smaller liberal, I mean, society. He puts in place that. Now, he wasn't the only one doing it in the world. Many governments, particularly Lyndon Johnson, were also legislating, but he does it in Canada. There's that, and there's that sense of ambition, that we can go out in the world and do interesting things if you're smart, you're strategic, you're opportunistic, and you're ambitious. That we need not be colonial, that there is a bigger Canada out there. These are the lessons today, that we can do things at home, we build the nation at home, but we build it abroad. And we go out there with confidence, and we don't cower, and we don't think, oh, we're too small, and we don't always defer to everybody. We think we're paying if we do, we carry our weight, we pay our dues, and we make our contribution. And so Mike Pearson believes in that, and he would be astounded, I think, today, and disappointed, mainly disappointed. I think sorrowful would be a better word, when he would see ourselves in the stage today, which I think is without imagination. When he would see a Maxime Bernier, I think he would think this is about the descent of everything I believed in, because this is not a serious foreign minister, and the government that could put him there is not serious about what it's doing. I think he would lament that. But I also think he would take some pride in looking around and seeing the Canada that he had attempted to forge, much of that Canada reflected in our society today. So that would give him great confidence and satisfaction. At home, Canada abroad, less so.
Andrew Cohen, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.